My boss gave me a choice: my father's funeral or my job. I chose my father. When he fired me for it, I expected to pack up my life in a cardboard box and disappear. What I never saw coming was that my entire team would stand up, strike a match, and burn the whole corporate kingdom to the ground just to stand with me. For 5 years, Omnicorp Dynamics wasn't just my workplace, it was my identity. I wasn't just a senior analyst, I was a true believer. I'd poured my 20s into that glass and steel tower in downtown Chicago, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the promise of the next performance bonus, the next promotion, the next hollow word of praise from my boss, Mr. Davies. I was the woman who lived on her laptop, who saw weekends as uninterrupted work time, and who believed that my fierce loyalty to the company would one day be repaid in kind. I sacrificed friendships, holidays, and sleep, all for a corporation that I was about to learn saw me as nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. Mr. Davies, the head of our division, was a man carved from the granite of a forgotten business era. He believed loyalty flowed in one direction: up. He saw his employees not as people, but as resources to be optimized. To him, profit and loss statements were high art, and employee burnout was simply the cost of doing business. He managed with a quiet, insidious pressure, creating a toxic culture where taking a sick day was a confession of weakness, and a vacation was an act of treason against the team. I once heard him tell a colleague who was leaving for his wedding, "Enjoy it. Just know that every day you're gone, your projects fall further behind. The market doesn't take a honeymoon." That was the man I answered to. I knew his rules, and for 5 years, I played his game better than anyone. I never dreamed I'd be the one to flip the board. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was my mom. Her voice was a fragile, broken thing that I barely recognized. "Jessica," she whispered, "it's your dad." She didn't have to say more. He'd had a massive coronary while tending to his beloved roses in the backyard. He was gone before the ambulance turned onto their street. My father was my anchor, a gentle, hardworking man who taught me the difference between a job and your life's work. He was the bedrock of our family, and in a single, devastating moment, that bedrock had turned to dust. The world spun off its axis, leaving only a deep, cavernous ache in my chest. Grief isn't just sadness, it's a physical weight. I could feel it settling on me. The weight of my mother's heartbreak, my brother's shock, and all the responsibilities that now rested squarely on my shoulders. There was no choice to be made, no pros and cons to weigh. My family needed me. I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my company laptop, and drafted a concise, professional email to Mr. Davies. I wasn't asking for permission. I was informing him of a fact. I explained that my father had passed away unexpectedly, and that I would be taking 1 week of bereavement leave, as per company policy, to arrange the funeral and be with my family. I hit send, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I knew the man I worked for. His reply landed in my inbox less than 5 minutes later. It was completely devoid of humanity. Not a single "I'm sorry for your loss" or "my condolences." It was just a cold, brutal calculation. It read, "Jessica, this is a deeply inconvenient time. We are heading into the end-of-quarter review, and your team is already stretched thin. I would strongly advise you to reconsider the timing of this leave." I read the email twice, my hands beginning to tremble. Not with grief, but with a surge of white-hot rage. Reconsider? Did he think my father had conveniently scheduled his death to disrupt the quarterly earnings report? I took a shuddering breath, trying to force down the fury. My fingers were stiff as I typed my reply. "I understand the timing is not ideal, but this is not a request. It is a family emergency. I will be out of the office for the remainder of the week." The final response was a digital execution. "Then, you are making a choice to abandon your team and your responsibilities at a critical moment. I expect you are prepared to face the consequences of that decision." That was it. I didn't dignify it with another reply. I slammed the laptop shut. The sharp crack of the plastic echoed the severing of a bond I once held sacred. I walked out of my apartment and drove to my mother's house. The next few days were a painful, surreal blur of phone calls, picking out a casket, writing a eulogy that felt impossible to deliver, and holding my mom while she sobbed in the dark. I compartmentalized my own sorrow, pushing it down to be the strong daughter my family needed. But in the silent, pre-dawn hours, Davy's words haunted me. I had made my choice. I just hadn't been handed the bill yet. A week later, I walked back into the OmniCorp offices. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with a strange electricity. As I crossed the open-plan floor, the familiar clatter of keyboards and quiet conversations faded into an eerie silence. Heads popped up over cubicle walls, faces etched with a mixture of pity and a tense, nervous curiosity. It felt like walking into a courtroom as the jury files in. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, making a straight line for my desk, bracing myself for the inevitable. I didn't have to wait. There it was at the top of my inbox, an email from Human Resources. The subject line was chillingly sterile, "Follow-up regarding your employment." My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked it open. The language was cold, corporate jargon designed to indemnify the company. "Following your unauthorized absence and failure to comply with direct management instructions, your employment with OmniCorp Dynamics has been terminated, effective immediately." Unauthorized absence. The phrase swam in my vision. I had provided a death certificate. They knew I was burying my father, and this was their verdict. My family's most profound tragedy reduced to a line-item breach of protocol. A cold, hard fury crystallized inside me, pushing aside the grief and anxiety. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white, just focusing on the simple act of breathing in and out. "He actually did it," a quiet voice said from my right. "That absolute monster." I turned to see Ethan, the lead software architect and the closest thing I had to a real friend in the office. He was brilliant, cynical, and had been at OmniCorp even longer than I had. His expression was grim, but behind his glasses, his eyes held a simmering fire I'd never seen before. I couldn't speak. I just gave a single, tight nod, a lump forming in my throat. He let out a long, weary sigh. "We all saw it, Jessica. The bastard forwarded your email exchange to HR and his own boss as documentation of your insubordination. He was making an example of you." It was then I became aware of the silence again. It wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. Every single person in our 30-person division was looking at us. They weren't working. They were watching, waiting. Before I could even process what was happening, Ethan turned and walked back to his desk. He didn't start packing. He simply bent over his printer, picked up a single, freshly printed sheet of paper, and strode toward Mr. Davies' glass-walled office at the corner of the floor. He knocked once, a sharp rap that echoed in the stillness. He didn't wait for a reply. He pushed the door open and dropped the paper onto the center of Davies' massive cherry wood desk. "This is my 2 weeks' notice," Ethan announced, his voice ringing with a clarity that carried across the entire office. "I refuse to work for a company or a man who fires an employee for attending her own father's funeral." Mr. Davies' jaw went slack. He opened his mouth, a sputtering, incoherent sound emerging, but it was already too late. The first stone had been thrown, and the avalanche was beginning. Qley, a senior project manager and one of the most respected people on the floor, stood up. Without a word, she walked to her printer, retrieved her own letter, and followed the exact path Ethan had blazed. She placed her resignation directly on top of his. "I'm with Ethan," she said, her voice firm. Then she turned and walked out of the office, not back to her desk. Then another, and another. It was a procession. One by one, my colleagues, people I had shared lunches and deadlines with for years, rose from their chairs. They were the veterans, the top performers, the indispensable ones who held the institutional knowledge. They were the heart, the brain, and the soul of the division. They printed their resignations, formed a solemn, orderly line at Davy's door, and laid them on the growing pyre. I sat there, frozen in my chair, watching in utter, breathtaking disbelief. The color drained from Davy's face, leaving it a pasty, terrified white. He stumbled out from behind his desk, his voice a desperate, cracking plea. "You can't do this, you have contracts. This is career suicide. Think about what you're doing." No one even gave him a second glance. They simply placed their letters on the pile and walked back to their desks, where they began to gather around me. They formed a silent, protective circle around my cubicle, offering a hand on my shoulder, a quiet word of solidarity, a shared look of defiant pride. This was no longer about me. It was about all the years of casual cruelty, the demeaning comments, the expectation that their lives were secondary to a spreadsheet. My firing wasn't the cause. It was just the final, unforgivable straw. By lunchtime, 15 people, the entire senior staff and half the division, had resigned. The office was in a state of quiet, organized chaos. Mr. Davies, the man who worshipped control, stood helpless in the middle of his glass cage, staring at the mountain of paper on his desk that signified the complete collapse of his authority. The company had tried to use me to enforce its culture of fear. Instead, my team had used him to demonstrate the real cost of inhumanity. The next morning, my phone started buzzing on my nightstand and didn't stop. I had wanted to unplug, to retreat into a cocoon of grief and process the whiplash of the last 24 hours. But the sheer volume of notifications was impossible to ignore. It was a flood of texts from my now former coworkers. Our group chat was a wildfire of updates and gallows humor. One message from Qley lit up my screen. "You will not believe this. Davies is in a full-blown meltdown. Corporate flew in 2 VPs from headquarters for an emergency divisional meeting, but there's almost no one left to meet with. They're realizing they didn't just lose an employee. They lost the whole engine." I sat up, the words sinking in. A small, bitter part of me felt a flash of vindication, but it was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of gratitude. These people hadn't just quit. They had committed an act of professional rebellion for a principle. An hour later, Ethan called, his voice buzzing with an energy I'd never heard from him. "Jess, you are not going to believe what just happened," he said, practically shouting. "The CEO just got involved." That made me sit bolt upright. "What, the actual CEO, Mr. Peterson?" "The one and only," Ethan confirmed, a laugh bubbling up. "Turns out, when half of your most profitable tech division quits on the same day, word travels upstairs fast. Vanguard Tech, our biggest account, called demanding to know why their entire project team suddenly had left the company on their email signatures. They threatened to pull their entire 8-figure contract unless Omni Corp rectified the catastrophic failure in management immediately. I was dumbfounded. I had imagined Davies getting a sternly worded memo from HR. This was a corporate earthquake, and he was standing at the epicenter. "And here's the best part," Ethan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Peterson himself came down from the penthouse suite. He stormed onto our floor, took one look at all the empty desks, and just pointed at Davies' office. He didn't even go in. He just beckoned him into the main conference room. The walls are thick, but not that thick." We heard shouting. 10 minutes later, Davies walked out with a security guard carrying a small cardboard box of his things. "He's gone, Jess, fired on the spot." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "You're kidding." "Dead serious," Ethan said. Now HR is in full-blown panic mode. They're calling everyone who resigned, practically begging them to come back. They're talking retention bonuses, a complete cultural overhaul, a new divisional head from outside the company. And you're going to love this. They want to offer your job back. I just stared at the wall, my mind reeling. In less than 48 hours, I had been grieving, fired, and avenged. Now the company that had discarded me like trash was about to come crawling back. Ethan seemed to read my mind. Look, I know what they're going to do. They'll offer you a promotion, probably Davy's old job, and a ridiculous amount of money to make this PR disaster go away. It'll be tempting. But after what they did, after what they showed you they were, could you ever trust them again? He didn't have to ask. The answer was already there, solid and unshakable. No, I said, a profound sense of calm settling over me for the first time in days. Not for all the money in the world. Ethan let out a triumphant whoop. That's my girl. I knew you'd say that. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, thanking him, Qley, and everyone else who had risked their careers for me. They had shown me a kind of loyalty I had mistakenly attributed to a company logo. Their loyalty was to each other, to a shared sense of right and wrong. A few days later, the official offer from Omni Corp landed in my inbox. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, full of insincere apologies for the unfortunate misunderstanding. It offered me my job back, a promotion to director, and a salary that made my eyes water. I read it once. Then, with a small smile, I forwarded the entire email chain to the group chat with Ethan, Qley, and the rest of the rebels. I added only one line of my own. Looks like they're finally ready to negotiate. I never went back. I found a new position at a smaller tech firm, a place where work-life balance wasn't just a recruiting slogan. It was a company that understood that people have lives, that they have families, that they grieve, and that human decency is the bedrock of any successful enterprise. Omni Corp, from what I heard, spent the better part of a year hemorrhaging clients and struggling to replace the talent and trust it had so arrogantly thrown away. I lost my father, and that is a wound that time will never completely heal. But in the ashes of that grief and the fire of that rebellion, I found something I never knew was missing. I discovered that my integrity wasn't for sale, and more importantly, I learned that sometimes the most powerful family you have is the one that chooses to stand with you when the world tries to force you to your knees.